Chapter 17 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Glenda Kindred. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 17. Barton's Night Errand. Mournful is to say farewell, though for few brief hours we part. In that absence, who can tell what may come to wring the heart? Anonymous. The events recorded in the last chapter took place on a Tuesday. On Thursday afternoon, Mary was surprised, in the midst of some little bustle in which she was engaged, by the entrance of Will Wilson. He looked strange, at least it was strange to see any different expression on his face to his usual joyous beaming appearance. He had a paper parcel in his hand. He came in and sat down, more quietly than usual. "Why, Will, what's the matter with you? You seem quite cut up about something." "And I am, Mary. I'm come to say good-bye, and few folk like to say good-bye to them they love." "Good-bye? Bless me, Will, that's sudden, isn't it?" Mary left off ironing, and came and stood near the fireplace. She had always liked Will, but now it seemed as if a sudden spring of sisterly love had gushed up in her heart, so sorry did she feel to hear of his approaching departure. "It's very sudden, isn't it?" said she, repeating the question. "Yes, it's very sudden," said he dreamily. No, it isn't," rousing himself to think of what he was saying. "The captain told me in a fortnight he would be ready to sail again, but it comes very sudden on me. I had got so fond of you all." Mary understood the particular fondness that was thus generalized. She spoke again. "But it's not a fortnight since you came, not a fortnight since you knocked at Jane Wilson's door, and I was there, you remember. Nothing like a fortnight." "No, I know it's not. But you see, I got a letter this afternoon from Jack Harris to tell me our ship sails on Tuesday next, and it's long since I promised my uncle, my mother's brother, him that lives at Kirk Christ beyond Ramsay, in the Isle of Man, that I'd go and see him and his this time of coming ashore. I must go. I'm sorry enough, but I mustn't slight poor mother's friends. I must go. Don't try to keep me," said he, evidently fearing the strength of his own resolution, if hard pressed by entreaty. "I'm not a-going, Will. I dare say you're right. Only I can't help feeling sorry you're going away. It seems so flat to be left behind. When do you go?" "Tonight. I shan't see you again." "Tonight? And you go to Liverpool? Maybe you and father will go together. He's going to Glasgow, by way of Liverpool." "No, I'm walking, and I don't think your father will be up to walking." "Well, and why on earth are you walking? You can get by railway for 3 and 6pence. "Ay, but Mary, thou mustn't let out what I'm going to tell thee. I haven't got 3 shillings, no, nor even a 6pence left, at least not here. Before I came, I gave my landlady enough to carry me to the island and back, and maybe a trifle for presents, and I brought the rest here. And it's all gone but this," jingling a few coppers in his hand. "Nay, never fret over my walking a matter of 30 mile," added he, as he saw she looked grave and sorry. "It's a fine clear night, and I shall set off betimes and get in afore the Manx packet sails. Where's your father going? To Glasgow, did you say? Perhaps he and I may have a bit of a trip together then, for if the Manx boat has sailed when I get into Liverpool, I shall go by a Scotch packet. What's he going to do in Glasgow? Seek for work? Trade is as bad there as here, folks say." "No, he knows that," answered Mary sadly. "I sometimes think he'll never get work again, and that trade will never mend. It's very hard to keep up one's heart. I wish I were a boy. I'd go to sea with you. It would be getting away from bad news at any rate, and now there's hardly a creature that crosses the doorstep but has something sad and unhappy to tell one. Father is going as a delegate from his union, to ask help from the Glasgow folk. He's starting this evening." Mary sighed, for the feeling again came over her that it was very flat to be left alone. "You say no one crosses the threshold but has something sad to say. You don't mean that Margaret Jennings has any trouble?" asked the young sailor anxiously. "No," replied Mary, smiling a little. "She's the only one I know, I believe, who seems free from care. Her blindness almost appears a blessing sometimes. She was so downhearted when she dreaded it, and now she seems so calm and happy when it's downright come. No, Margaret's happy, I do think." "I could almost wish it had been otherwise," said Will thoughtfully. "I could have been so glad to comfort her and cherish her if she had been in trouble." "And why can't you cherish her, even though she is happy?" asked Mary. "Oh, I don't know. She seems so much better than I am. And her voice, when I hear it and think of the wishes that are in my heart, it seems as much out of place to ask her to be my wife as it would be to ask an angel from heaven." Mary could not help laughing outright, in spite of her depression, at the idea of Margaret as an angel. It was so difficult, even to her dressmaking imagination, to fancy where and how the wings would be fastened to the brown stuff gown, or the blue and yellow print. Will laughed too, a little, out of sympathy with Mary's pretty merry laugh. Then he said, "Ay, you may laugh, Mary. It only shows you've never been in love." In an instant Mary was carnation colour, and the tears sprang to her soft grey eyes. She that was suffering so much from the doubts arising from love. It was unkind of him. He did not notice her change of look and of complexion. He only noticed that she was silent, so he continued, I think, that when I come back from this voyage I will speak. It's my 4th voyage in the same ship, and with the same captain, and he's promised he'll make me a second mate after this trip. Then I shall have something to offer Margaret, and her grandfather, and Aunt Alice shall live with her, and keep her from being lonesome while I'm at sea. I'm speaking as if she cared for me and would marry me. Do you think she does care at all for me, Mary?" asked he anxiously. Mary had a very decided opinion of her own on the subject, but she did not feel as if she had any right to give it. So she said, "You must ask Margaret, not me, Will. She's never named your name to me." His countenance fell. "But I should say that was a good sign from a girl like her. I've no right to say what I think, but if I was you, I would not leave her now without speaking." "No, I cannot speak. I have tried. I've been in to wish them good-bye, and my voice stuck in my throat. I could say naught of what I'd planned to say, and I never thought of being so bold as to offer her marriage till I'd been my next trip and been made mate. I could not even offer her this box," said he, undoing his paper parcel, and displaying a gaudily ornamented accordion. "I longed to buy her something, and I thought if it were something in the music line she would maybe fancy it more. So will you give it to her, Mary, when I'm gone? And if you can slip in something tender, something, you know, of what I feel, maybe she would listen to you, Mary." Mary promised that she would do all that he asked. "I shall be thinking on her many and many a night when I'm keeping my watch in mid-sea. I wonder if she will ever think on me when the wind is whistling and the gale rising. You'll often speak of me to her, Mary, and if I should meet with any mischance, tell her how dear, how very dear she was to me, and bid her, for the sake of one who loved her well, try and comfort my poor Aunt Alice. Dear old aunt! You and Margaret will often go and see her, won't you? She's sadly failed since I was last ashore. And so good as she has been! When I lived with her, a little wee chap, I used to be wakened by the neighbours knocking her up. This one was ill, and that body's child was restless, and for as tired as ever she might be, she would be up and dressed in a twinkling, never thinking of the hard day's wash afore her next morning. Them were happy times. How pleased I used to be when she would take me into the fields with her to gather herbs. I've tasted tea in China since then, but it wasn't half so good as the herb tea she used to make for me o' Sunday nights. And she knew such a deal about plants and birds and their ways. She used to tell me long stories about her childhood, and we used to plan how we would go sometime, please God, that was always her word, and live near her old home beyond Lancaster, in the very cottage where she was born, if we could get it. Dear, and how different it is! Here is she still in a back street of Manchester, never likely to see her own home again, and I, a sailor, off for America next week. I wish she had been able to go to Burton once afore she died. She would maybe have found all sadly changed, said Mary, though her heart echoed Will's feeling. Ay, I dare say it's best. One thing I do wish, though, and I have often wished it when out alone on the deep sea, when even the most thoughtless can't choose but think on the past and the future, and that is, that I'd never grieved her. Oh, Mary, many a hasty word comes sorely back on the heart when one thinks one shall never see the person whom one has grieved again. They both stood thinking. Suddenly Mary started. That's father's step, and his shirt's not ready. She hurried to her irons and tried to make up for lost time. John Barton came in, such a haggard and wildly anxious-looking man Will thought he had never seen. He looked at Will, but spoke no word of greeting or welcome. "I'm come to bid you good-bye," said the sailor, and would, in his sociable friendly humour, have gone on speaking, but John answered abruptly, "Good-bye to ye, then." There was that in his manner which left no doubt of his desire to get rid of the visitor, and Will accordingly shook hands with Mary, and looked at John, as if doubting how far to offer to shake hands with him. But he met with no answering glance or gesture, so he went his way, stopping for an instant at the door to say, "You'll think on me on Tuesday, Mary. That's the day we shall hoist our blue Peter, Jack Harris says." Mary was heartily sorry when the door closed. It seemed like shutting out a friendly sunbeam. And her father! What could be the matter with him? He was so restless, not speaking, she wished he would, but starting up and then sitting down and meddling with her irons. He seemed so fierce, too, to judge from his face. She wondered if he disliked Will being there, or if he were vexed to find that she had not got further on with her work. At last she could bear his nervous way no longer. It made her equally nervous and fidgety. She would speak. "When are you going, father? I don't know the time of the trains." "And why shouldst thou know?" replied he gruffly. "Meddle with thy ironing, but donnot be asking questions about what doesn't concern thee." "I wanted to get you something to eat first," answered she gently. "Thou dost not know that I'm larning to do without food," said he. Mary looked at him to see if he spoke jestingly. No, he looked savagely grave. She finished her bit of ironing, and began preparing the food she was sure her father needed, for by this time her experience in the degrees of hunger had taught her that his present irritability was increased, if not caused, by want of food. He had had a sovereign given to him to pay his expenses as delegate to Glasgow, and out of this he had given Mary a few shillings in the morning, so she had been able to buy a sufficient meal, and now her care was to cook it so as to tempt him. "If thou'rt doing that for me, Mary, thou mayst spare thy labour. I tell thee I were not for eating." "Just a little bit, father, before starting," coaxed Mary perseveringly. At that instant who should come in but Job Legh. It was not often he came, but when he did pay visits, Mary knew from past experience they were anything but short. Her father's countenance fell back into the deep gloom from which it was but just emerging at the sound of Mary's sweet voice and pretty pleading. He became again restless and fidgety, scarcely giving Job Legh the greeting necessary for a host in his own house. Job, however, did not stand upon ceremony. He had come to pay a visit, and was not to be daunted from his purpose. He was interested in John Barton's mission to Glasgow, and wanted to hear all about it. So he sat down and made himself comfortable, in a manner that Mary saw was meant to be stationary. "So, thou'rt off to Glasgow, art thou?" he began his catechism. "Ay." "When art starting?" "To-night." "That I knowed, but by what train?" That was just what Mary wanted to know, but what apparently her father was in no mood to tell. He got up without speaking, and went upstairs. Mary knew from his step and his way how much he was put out, and feared Job would see it too. But no, Job seemed imperturbable. So much the better, and perhaps she could cover her father's rudeness by her own civility to so kind a friend. So, half listening to her father's movements upstairs, passionate, violent, restless motions they were, and half attending to Job Legh, she tried to pay him all due regard. "When does thy father start, Mary?" That plaguing question again. "Oh, very soon. I'm just getting him a bit of supper. Is Margaret very well?" "Yes, she's well enough. She's meaning to go and keep Alice Wilson company for an hour or so this evening, as soon as she thinks her nephew will have started for Liverpool, for she fancies the old woman will feel a bit lonesome. The Union is paying for your father, I suppose?" "Yes, they've given him a sovereign. You're one of the Union, Job?" "Ay, I'm one sure enough, but I'm a sleeping partner in the concern. I were obliged to become a member for peace, else I don't go along with them. You see they think themselves wise and me silly for differing with them. Well, there's no harm in that, but then they won't let me be silly in peace and quietness, but will force me to be as wise as they are. Now that's not British liberty, I say. I'm forced to be wise according to their notions, else they parsecute me and sarve me out." What could her father be doing upstairs, tramping and banging about? Why did he not come down? Or why did not Job go? The supper would be spoilt. But Job had no notion of going. "You see, my folly is this, Mary. I would take what I could get. I think half a loaf is better than no bread. I would work for low wages rather than sit idle and starve. But comes the Trades Union and says, 'Well, if you take the half loaf, we'll worry you out of your life. Will you be clemmed or will you be worried?' Now clemming is a quiet death, and worrying isn't, so I choose clemming and come into the Union. But I'd wish they'd leave me free if I am a fool." Creak, creak went the stairs. Her father was coming down at last. Yes, he came down, but more doggedly fierce than before, and made up for his journey too, with his little bundle on his arm. He went up to Job, and more civilly than Mary expected, wished him good-bye. He then turned to her, and in a short, cold manner bade her farewell. "Oh, father, don't go yet. Your supper is all ready. Stay one moment." But he pushed her away and was gone. She followed him to the door, her eyes blinded by sudden tears. She stood there looking after him. He was so strange, so cold, so hard. Suddenly, at the end of the court, he turned, and saw her standing there. He came back quickly and took her in his arms. "God bless thee, Mary. God in heaven bless thee, poor child." She threw her arms round his neck. "Don't go yet, father. I can't bear you to go yet. Come in and eat some supper. You look so ghastly. Dear father, do." "No," he said, faintly and mournfully. "It's best as it is. I couldn't eat, and it's best to be off. I cannot be still at home. I must be moving." So saying, he unlaced her soft, twining arms, and kissing her once more, set off on his fierce errand. And he was out of sight. She did not know why, but she had never before felt so depressed, so desolate. She turned in to Job, who sat there still. Her father, as soon as he was out of sight, slackened his pace, and fell into that heavy listless step which told, as well as words could do, of hopelessness and weakness. It was getting dark, but he loitered on, returning no greeting to anyone. A child's cry caught his ear. His thoughts were running on little Tom, on the dead and buried child of happier years. He followed the sound of the wail that might have been his, and found a poor little mortal who had lost his way, and whose grief had choked up his thoughts to the single want. "Mammy, mammy!" With tender address John Barton soothed the little laddie, and with beautiful patience he gathered fragments of meaning from the half-spoken words which came mingled with sobs from the terrified little heart. So, aided by inquiries here and there from a passer-by, he led and carried the little fellow home, where his mother had been too busy to miss him, but now received him with thankfulness and with an eloquent Irish blessing. When John heard the words of blessing, he shook his head mournfully, and turned away to retrace his steps. Let us leave him. Mary took her sewing after he had gone, and sat on, trying to listen to Job, who was more inclined to talk than usual. She had conquered her feeling of impatience towards him so far as to be able to offer him her father's rejected supper, and she even tried to eat herself, but her heart failed her. A leaden weight seemed to hang over her, a sort of presentiment of evil, or perhaps only an excess of low-spirited feeling in consequence of the 2 departures which had taken place that afternoon. She wondered how long Job Legh would sit. She did not like putting down her work and crying before him, and yet she had never in her life longed so much to be alone in order to indulge in a good hearty burst of tears. "Well, Mary," she suddenly caught him saying, "I thought you'd be a bit lonely to-night, and as Margaret were going to cheer the old woman, I said I'd go and keep the young in company, and a very pleasant chatty evening we've had, very. Only I wonder as Margaret is not come back." "But perhaps she is," suggested Mary. "No, no, I took care of that. Look ye here," and he pulled out the great house key. "She'll have to stand waiting i' the street, and that I'm sure she wouldn't do when she knew where to find me." "Will she come back by hersel?" asked Mary. "Ay, at first I were afraid o' trusting her, and I used to follow her a bit behind, never letting on, of course. But bless you, she goes along as steadily as can be, rather slow to be sure, and her head a bit on one side, as if she were listening. And it's real beautiful to see her cross the road. She'll wait above a bit to hear that all is still. Not that she's so dark as not to see a coach or a cart like a big black thing, but she can't rightly judge how far off it is by sight. So she listens. Hark! That's her." Yes, in she came, with her usually calm face all tear-stained and sorrow-marked. "What's the matter, my wench?" said Job hastily. "Oh, grandfather, Alice Wilson's so bad." She could say no more for her breathless agitation. The afternoon and the parting with Will had weakened her nerves for any aftershock. "What is it? Do tell us, Margaret," said Mary, placing her in a chair and loosening her bonnet strings. "I think it's a stroke, or the palsy. At any rate, she has lost the use of one side." "Was it afore Will set off?" asked Mary. "No, he were gone before I got there," said Margaret, and she were much about as well as she had been for many a day. She spoke a bit, but not much, but that were only natural, for Mrs. Wilson likes to have the talk to hersel, you know. She got up to go across the room, and then I heard a drag wi' her leg, and presently a fall, and Mrs. Wilson came running, and set up such a cry, I stopped wi' Alice while she fetched a doctor, but she could not speak to answer me, though she tried, I think." "Where was Jem? Why didn't he go for the doctor?" "He were out when I got there, and he never came home while I stopped." "Thou'st never left Mrs. Wilson alone wi' poor Alice?" asked Job hastily. "No, no," said Margaret, "but oh, grandfather, it's now I feel how hard it is to have lost my sight. I should have so loved to nurse her, and I did try, until I found I did more harm than good. Oh, grandfather, if I could but see!" She sobbed a little, and they let her give that ease to her heart. Then she went on. "No, I went round by Mrs. Davenport's, and she were hard at work, but the minute I told my errand, she were ready and willing to go to Jane Wilson, and stop up all night with Alice." "And what does the doctor say?" asked Mary. "Oh, much what all doctors say. He puts a fence on this side and a fence on that, for fear he should be caught tripping in his judgment. One moment he does not think there's much hope, but while there is life there is hope. The next he says he should think she might recover partial, but her age is a gainer. He's ordered her leeches to her head." Margaret, having told her tale, leant back with weariness, both of body and mind. Mary hastened to make her a cup of tea, while Job, lately so talkative, sat quiet and mournfully silent. "I'll go first thing to-morrow morning and learn how she is, and I'll bring word back before I go to work," said Mary. "It's a bad job Will's gone," said Job. "Jane does not think she knows any one," replied Margaret. "It's perhaps as well he shouldn't see her now, for they say her face is sadly drawn. He'll remember her with her own face better if he does not see her again." With a few more sorrowful remarks they separated for the night, and Mary was left alone in her house to meditate on the heavy day that had passed over her head. Everything seemed going wrong. Will gone, her father gone, and so strangely too, and to a place so mysteriously distant as Glasgow seemed to be to her. She had felt his presence as a protection against Harry Carson and his threats, and now she dreaded lest he should learn she was alone. Her heart began to despair, too, about Jem. She feared he had ceased to love her, and she only loved him more and more for his seeming neglect. And, as if all this aggregate of sorrowful thoughts was not enough, here was this new woe of poor Alice's paralytic stroke. End of chapter 17. Recording by Glenda Kindred.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 18. Murder. But in his pulse there was no throb, nor on his lips one dying sob, sigh, nor word, nor struggling breath heralded his way to death. Siege of Corinth. My brain runs this way and that way. 'Twill not fix on aught but vengeance. Duke of Guise. I must go back now to an hour or two before Mary and her friends parted for the night. It might be about 8 o'clock that evening, and the three Miss Carsons were sitting in their father's drawing-room. He was asleep in the dining-room, in his own comfortable chair. Mrs. Carson was, as was usual with her when no particular excitement was going on, very poorly, and sitting upstairs in her dressing-room, indulging in the luxury of a headache. She was not well, certainly. Wind in the head, the servants called it. But it was but the natural consequence of the state of mental and bodily idleness in which she was placed. Without education enough to value the resources of wealth and leisure, she was so circumstanced as to command both. It would have done her more good than all the ether and sal volatile she was daily in the habit of swallowing, if she might have taken the work of one of her own housemaids for a week, made beds, rubbed tables, shaken carpets, and gone out into the fresh morning air, without all the paraphernalia of shawl, cloak, boa, fur boots, bonnet, and veil, in which she was equipped before setting out for an airing, in the closely shut-up carriage. So the three girls were by themselves in the comfortable, elegant, well-lighted drawing-room, and like many similarly situated young ladies, they did not exactly know what to do to while away the time until the tea-hour. The elder two had been at a dancing party the night before, and were listless and sleepy in consequence. One tried to read Emerson's Essays, and fell asleep in the attempt; the other was turning over a parcel of new songs, in order to select what she liked. Amy, the youngest, was copying some manuscript music. The air was heavy with the fragrance of strongly scented flowers, which sent out their night odours from an adjoining conservatory. The clock on the chimney-piece chimed 8. Sophie, the sleeping sister, started up at the sound. "What o'clock is that?" she asked. 8, said Amy. "Oh dear, how tired I am! Is Harry come in? Tea will rouse one up a little. Are you not worn out, Helen?" "Yes, I am tired enough. One is good for nothing, the day after a dance. Yet I don't feel weary at the time. I suppose it is the lateness of the hours. And yet, how could it be managed otherwise? So many don't dine till 5 or 6, that one cannot begin before 8 or 9, and then it takes a long time to get into the spirit of the evening. It is always more pleasant after supper than before. Well, I'm too tired tonight to reform the world in the matter of dances or balls. What are you copying, Amy? Only that little Spanish air you sing, Quen quiera. What are you copying it for? Asked Helen. Harry asked me to do it for him this morning at breakfast time, for Miss Richardson, he said. For Jane Richardson, said Sophy, as if a new idea were receiving strength in her mind. Do you think Harry means anything by his attentions to her? asked Helen. Nay, I do not know anything more than you do. I can only observe and conjecture. What do you think, Helen? Harry always likes to be of consequence to the belle of the room. If one girl is more admired than another, he likes to flutter about her, and seem to be on intimate terms with her. That is his way, and I have not noticed anything beyond that in his manner to Jane Richardson. But I don't think she knows it's only his way. Just watch her the next time we meet her when Harry is there, and see how she crimsons, and looks another way when she feels he is coming up to her. I think he sees it too, and I think he is pleased with it. I dare say Harry would like well enough to turn the head of such a lovely girl as Jane Richardson, but I'm not convinced that he's in love, whatever she may be. Well, then, said Sophy indignantly, though it is our own brother, I do not think he is behaving very wrongly. The more I think of it, the more I am sure she thinks he means something, and that he intends her to think so. And then when he leaves off paying her attention— "Which will be as soon as a prettier girl makes her appearance," interrupted Helen. "As soon as he leaves off paying her attention," resumed Sophy, "she will have many and many a heartache, and then she will harden herself into being a flirt, a feminine flirt, as he is a masculine flirt. Poor girl!" "I don't like to hear you speak so of Harry," said Amy, looking up at Sophy. "And I don't like to have to speak so, Amy, for I love him dearly. He is a good, kind brother, but I do think him vain, and I think he hardly knows the misery, the crime, to which indulged vanity may lead him." Helen yawned. "Oh, do you think we may ring for tea? Sleeping after dinner makes me so feverish." "Yes, surely. Why should not we?" said the more energetic Sophy, pulling the bell with some determination. "Tea directly, Parker," she said authoritatively, as the man entered the room. She was too little in the habit of reading the expressions on the faces of others to notice Parker's countenance. Yet it was striking. It was blanched to a dead whiteness, the lips compressed as if to keep within some tale of horror, the eyes distended and unnatural. It was a terror-stricken face. The girls began to put away their music and books, in preparation for tea. The door slowly opened again, and this time it was the nurse who entered. I call her nurse, for such had been her office in bygone days, though now she held rather an anomalous situation in the family. Seamstress, attendant on the young ladies, keeper of the stores, only nurse was still her name. She had lived longer with them than any other servant, and to her their manner was far less haughty than to the other domestics. She occasionally came into the drawing-room to look for things belonging to their father or mother, so it did not excite any surprise when she advanced into the room. They went on arranging their various articles of employment. She wanted them to look up. She wanted them to read something in her face so full of woe, of horror. But they went on without taking any notice. She coughed, not a natural cough, but one of those coughs which ask so plainly for a remark. "Dear nurse, what is the matter?" asked Amy. "Are you not well?" "Is mamma ill?" asked Sophy quickly. "Speak, speak, nurse!" said they all, as they saw her efforts to articulate choked by the convulsive rising in her throat. They clustered around her with eager faces, catching a glimpse of some terrible truth to be revealed. "My dear young ladies! My dear girls!" she gasped out at length, and then she burst into tears. "Oh, do tell us what it is," said one. "Anything is better than this. Speak!" "My children, I don't know how to break it to you. My dears, poor Mr. Harry's brought home. Brought home! Brought home! How?" Instinctively they sank their voices to a whisper, but a fearful whisper it was. In the same low tone, as if afraid lest the walls, the furniture, the inanimate things which told of preparation for life and comfort should hear, she answered, "Dead." Amy clutched her nurse's arm, and fixed her eyes on her as if to know if such a tale could be true, and when she read its confirmation in those sad, mournful, unflinching eyes, she sank, without word or sound, down in a faint upon the floor. One sister sat down on an ottoman and covered her face, to try and realise it. That was Sophy. Helen threw herself on the sofa, and burying her head in the pillows, tried to stifle the screams and moans which shook her frame. The nurse stood silent. She had not told all. "Tell me," said Sophy, looking up, and speaking in a hoarse voice, which told of the inward pain. "Tell me, nurse. Is he dead, did you say? Have you sent for a doctor? Oh, send for one, send for one," continued she, her voice rising to shrillness, and starting to her feet. Helen lifted herself up, and looked, with breathless waiting, towards the nurse. "My dears, he is dead. But I have sent for a doctor. I have done all I could." When did they bring him home?" asked Sophy. "Perhaps 10 minutes ago, before you rang for Parker." "How did he die? Where did they find him? He looked so well. He always seemed so strong. Oh, are you sure he is dead?" She went towards the door. Nurse laid her hand on her arm. "Miss Sophy, I have not told you all. Can you bear to hear it? Remember, master is in the next room, and he knows nothing yet. Come, you must help me to tell him. Now, be quiet, dear. It was no common death he died." She looked in her face as if trying to convey her meaning by her eyes. Sophy's lips moved, but nurse could hear no sound. "He has been shot as he was coming home along Turner Street to-night." Sophy went on with the motion of her lips, twitching them almost convulsively. "My dear, you must rouse yourself, and remember your father and mother have yet to be told. Speak, Miss Sophy." But she could not. Her whole face worked involuntarily. The nurse left the room, and almost immediately brought back some sal volatile and water. Sophy drank it eagerly, and gave 1 or 2 deep gasps. Then she spoke in a calm, unnatural voice. "What do you want me to do, nurse?" "Go to Helen and poor Amy. See, they want help." "Poor creatures! We must let them alone for a bit. You must go to master, that's what I want you to do, Miss Sophy. You must break it to him. Poor gentleman! Come, he's asleep in the dining room, and the men are waiting to speak to him." Sophy went mechanically to the dining room door. "Oh, I cannot go in. I cannot tell him. What must I say?" "I'll come with you, Miss Sophy. Break it to him by degrees." "I can't, nurse. My head throbs so, I shall be sure to say the wrong thing." However, she opened the door. There sat her father, the shaded light of the candle lamp falling upon, and softening his marked features, while his snowy hair contrasted well with the deep crimson morocco of the chair. The newspaper he had been reading had dropped on the carpet by his side. He breathed regularly and deeply. At that instant the words of Mrs. Hemans's song came full in Sophy's mind: "Ye know not what ye do, that call the slumberer back from the realms unseen by you, to life's dim weary track." But this life's track would be to the bereaved father something more than dim and weary, hereafter. "Papa!" she said softly. He did not stir. "Papa!" she exclaimed, somewhat louder. He started up, half awake. "Tea is ready, is it?" and he yawned. "No, papa, but something very dreadful, very sad has happened." He was gaping so loud that he did not catch the words she uttered, and did not see the expression of her face. "Master Henry has not come back," said nurse. Her voice, heard in unusual speech to him, arrested his attention, and rubbing his eyes, he looked at the servant. "Harry! Oh, no, he had to attend a meeting of the masters about those cursed turnouts. I don't expect him yet. What are you looking at me so strangely for, Sophy?" "Oh, papa, Harry is come back," said she, bursting into tears. "What do you mean?" said he, startled into an impatient consciousness that something was wrong. "One of you says he has not come home, and the other says he is. Now, that's nonsense. Tell me at once what's the matter. Did he go on horseback to town? Is he thrown? Speak, child, can't you?" "No, he's not been thrown, papa," said Sophy, sadly. "But he's badly hurt," put in the nurse, desirous to be drawing his anxiety to a point. "Hurt! Where? How? Have you sent for a doctor?" said he, hastily rising as if to leave the room. "Yes, papa, we've sent for a doctor, but I'm afraid I believe it's of no use." He looked at her for a moment, and in her face he read the truth. His son, his only son, was dead. He sank back in his chair, and hid his face in his hands, and bowed his head upon the table. The strong mahogany dining table shook and rattled under his agony. Sophy went and put her hands around his bowed neck. "Go! You are not Harry," said he, but the action roused him. "Where is he? Where is he?" said he, with his strong face set into the lines of anguish by 2 minutes of such intense woe. "In the servants' hall," said nurse. "2 policemen and another man brought him home. They would be glad to speak to you when you are able, sir." "I am now able," replied he. At first when he stood up he tottered, but steadying himself he walked, as firmly as a soldier on drill, to the door. Then he turned back and poured out a glass of wine from the decanter which yet remained on the table. His eye caught the wine-glass which Harry had used but 2 or 3 hours before. He sighed a long, quivering sigh, and then, mastering himself again, left the room. "You had better go back to your sisters, Miss Sophy," said nurse. Miss Carson went. She could not face death yet. The nurse followed Mr. Carson to the servants' hall. There, on their dinner table, lay the poor dead body. The men who had brought it were sitting near the fire, while several of the servants stood around the table, gazing at the remains. The remains! One or two were crying, one or two were whispering, awed into a strange stillness of voice and action by the presence of the dead. When Mr. Carson came in they all drew back and looked at him with the reverence due to sorrow. He went forward and gazed long and fondly on the calm, dead face. Then he bent down and kissed the lips yet crimson with life. The policeman had advanced, and stood ready to be questioned. But at first the old man's mind could only take in the idea of death. Slowly, slowly came the conception of violence, of murder. "How did he die?" he groaned forth. The policemen looked at each other. Then one began, and stated that, having heard the report of a gun in Turner Street, he had turned down that way, a lonely, unfrequented way, Mr. Carson knew, but a short cut to his garden door, of which Harry had a key; that as he, the policeman, came nearer, he had heard footsteps as of a man running away, but the evening was so dark, the moon not having yet risen, that he could see no one 20 yards off; that he had even been startled, when close to the body, by seeing it lying across the path at his feet; that he had sprung his rattle, and when another policeman came up, by the light of the lantern they had discovered who it was that had been killed; that they believed him to be dead when they first took him up, as he had never moved, spoken, or breathed; that intelligence of the murder had been sent to the superintendent, who would probably soon be here; that 2 or 3 policemen were still about the place where the murder was committed, seeking out for some trace of the murderer. Having said this, they stopped speaking. Mr. Carson had listened attentively, never taking his eyes off the dead body. When they had ended, he said, "Where was he shot?" They lifted up some of the thick chestnut curls, and showed a blue spot, you could hardly call it a hole, the flesh had closed so much over it, in the left temple. A deadly aim, and yet it was so dark a night. "He must have been close upon him," said one policeman. "And have had him between him and the sky," added the other. There was a little commotion at the door of the room, and there stood poor Mrs. Carson, the mother. She had heard unusual noises in the house, and had sent down her maid, much more a companion to her than her highly educated daughters, to discover what was going on. But the maid either forgot or dreaded to return, and with nervous impatience Mrs. Carson came down herself, and had traced the hum and buzz of voices to the servants' hall. Mr. Carson turned round. But he could not leave the dead for any one leaving. "Take her away, nurse. It is no sight for her. Tell Miss Sophy to go to her mother." His eyes were again fixed on the dead face of his son. Presently Mrs. Carson's hysterical cries were heard all over the house. Her husband shuddered at the outward expression of the agony which was rending his heart. Then the police superintendent came, and after him the doctor. The latter went through all the forms of ascertaining death, without uttering a word, and when at the conclusion of the operation of opening a vein, from which no blood flowed, he shook his head, all present understood the confirmation of their previous belief. The superintendent asked to speak to Mr. Carson in private. "It was just what I was going to request of you," answered he, so he led the way into the dining room, with the wine-glass still on the table. The door was carefully shut, and both sat down, each apparently waiting for the other to begin. At last Mr. Carson spoke. "You probably have heard that I am a rich man." The superintendent bowed in assent. "Well, sir, half, nay, if necessary, the whole of my fortune I will give to have the murderer brought to the gallows. Every exertion, you may be sure, sir, shall be used on our part, but probably offering a handsome reward might accelerate the discovery of the murderer. But what I wanted particularly to tell you, sir, is that one of my men has already got some clue, and that another, who accompanied me here, has within this quarter of an hour found a gun in the field which the murderer crossed, and which he probably threw away when pursued, as encumbering his flight. I have not the smallest doubt of discovering the murderer." "What do you call a handsome reward?" said Mr. Carson. "Well, sir, 300 or 500 pounds is a munificent reward, more than will probably be required as a temptation to any accomplice." "Make it 1,000," said Mr. Carson, decisively. "It's the doing of those damned turnouts." "I imagine not," said the superintendent. Some days ago the man I was naming to you before reported to the inspector, when he came on his beat, that he had to separate your son from a young man, who by his dress he believed to be employed in a foundry, that the man had thrown Mr. Carson down, and seemed inclined to proceed to more violence, when the policeman came up and interfered. Indeed, my man wished to give him in charge for an assault, but Mr. Carson would not allow that to be done." "Just like him, noble fellow," murmured the father. "But after your son had left, the man made use of some pretty strong threats. And it's rather a curious coincidence that this scuffle took place in the very same spot where the murder was committed, in Turner Street." There was some one knocking at the door of the room. It was Sophy, who beckoned her father out, and then asked him, in an awestruck whisper, to come upstairs and speak to her mother. "She will not leave Harry, and talks so strangely. Indeed, papa, I think she has lost her senses." And the poor girl sobbed bitterly. "Where is she?" asked Mr. Carson. "In his room." They went upstairs rapidly and silently. It was a large, comfortable bedroom, too large to be well lighted by the flaring, flickering kitchen candle, which had been hastily snatched up, and now stood on the dressing table. On the bed, surrounded by its heavy, pall-like green curtains, lay the dead son. They had carried him up, and had laid him down, as tenderly as though they feared to waken him, and indeed it looked more like sleep than death, so very calm and full of repose was the face. You saw, too, the chiselled beauty of the features much more perfectly than when the brilliant colouring of life had distracted your attention. There was a peace about him, which told that death had come too instantaneously to give any previous pain. In a chair at the head of the bed sat the mother, smiling. She held one of the hands, rapidly stiffening even in her warm grasp, and gently stroked the back of it, with the endearing caress she had used to all her children when young. "I am glad you are come," said she, looking up at her husband, and still smiling. "Harry is so full of fun, he always has something new to amuse us with. And now he pretends he is asleep, and that we can't waken him. Look! He is smiling now. He hears I have found him out. Look!" And in truth the lips, in the rest of death, did look as though they wore a smile, and the waving light of the unsnuffed candle almost made them seem to move. "Look, Amy," said she to her youngest child, who knelt at her feet, trying to soothe her by kissing her garments. "Oh, he was always such a rogue. You remember, don't you, love, how full of play he was as a baby, hiding his face under my arm, when you wanted to play with him. Always a rogue, Harry." "We must get her away, sir," said nurse. "You know there is much to be done before—" "I understand, nurse," said the father, hastily interrupting her in dread of the distinct words which would tell of the changes of mortality. "Come, love," said he to his wife. "I want you to come with me. I want to speak to you downstairs." "I'm coming," said she, rising. "Perhaps, after all, nurse, he's really tired, and would be glad to sleep. Don't let him get cold, though. He feels rather chilly," continued she, after she had bent down and kissed the pale lips. Her husband put his arm round her waist, and they left the room. Then the three sisters burst into unrestrained wailings. They were startled into the reality of life and death. And yet, in the midst of shrieks and moans, of shivering and chattering of teeth, Sophy's eye caught the calm beauty of the dead, so calm amidst such violence, and she hushed her emotion. "Come," said she to her sisters, "nurse wants us to go, and besides we ought to be with mamma. Papa told the man he was talking to, when I went for him, to wait, and she must not be left." Meanwhile, the superintendent had taken a candle, and was examining the engravings that hung around the dining room. It was so common to him to be acquainted with crime, that he was far from feeling all his interest absorbed in the present case of violence, although he could not help having much anxiety to detect the murderer. He was busy looking at the only oil painting in the room, a youth of 18 or so in a fancy dress, and conjecturing its identity with the young man so mysteriously dead, when the door opened, and Mr. Carson returned. Stern as he had looked before leaving the room, he looked far sterner now. His face was hardened into deep purposed wrath. "I beg your pardon, sir, for leaving you." The superintendent bowed. They sat down and spoke long together. One by one the policemen were called in, and questioned. All through the night there was a bustle and commotion in the house. Nobody thought of going to bed. It seemed strange to Sophy to hear nurse summoned from her mother's side to supper in the middle of the night, and still stranger that she could go. The necessity of eating and drinking seemed out of place in the house of death. When night was passing into morning, the dining-room door opened, and 2 persons' steps were heard along the hall. The superintendent was leaving at last. Mr. Carson stood on the front doorstep, feeling the refreshment of the cooler morning air, and seeing the starlight fade away into dawn. "You will not forget," said he. "I trust to you." The policeman bowed. "Spare no money. The only purpose for which I now value wealth is to have the murderer arrested, and brought to justice. My hope in life, now, is to see him sentenced to death. Offer any rewards. Name £1,000 in the placards. Come to me at any hour, night or day, if that be required. All I ask of you is, to get the murderer hanged. Next week, if possible. To-day is Friday. Surely, with the clues you already possess, you can muster up evidence sufficient to have him tried next week." "He may easily request an adjournment of his trial, on the ground of the shortness of the notice," said the superintendent. "Oppose it, if possible. I will see that the first lawyers are employed. I shall know no rest while he lives." "Everything shall be done, sir." "You will arrange with the coroner. 10 o'clock, if convenient." The superintendent took leave. Mr. Carson stood on the step, dreading to shut out the light and air, and return into the haunted, gloomy house. "My son, my son!" he said at last. "But you shall be avenged, my poor murdered boy." Ay, to avenge his wrongs the murderer had singled out his victim, and with one fell action had taken away the life that God had given. To avenge his child's death the old man lived on, with the single purpose in his heart of vengeance on the murderer. True, his vengeance was sanctioned by law, but was it the less revenge? "Are ye worshippers of Christ, or of Alecto? Oh, Orestes, you would have made a very tolerable Christian of the 19th century." Chapter 18. Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 19. Jem Wilson arrested on suspicion. Deeds to be hid, which were not hid, which all confused, I could not know, whether I suffered or did, for all seemed guilt, remorse, or woe. Coleridge. I left Mary, on that same Thursday night which left its burden of woe at Mr. Carson's threshold, haunted with depressing thoughts. All through the night she tossed restlessly about, trying to get quit of the ideas that harassed her, and longing for the light when she could rise, and find some employment. But just as dawn began to appear, she became more quiet, and fell into a sound, heavy sleep, which lasted till she was sure it was late in the morning, by the full light that shone in. She dressed hastily, and heard the neighbouring church clock strike 8. It was far too late to do as she had planned, after inquiring how Alice was, to return and tell Margaret, and she accordingly went in to inform the latter of her change of purpose, and the cause of it, but on entering the house she found Job sitting alone, looking sad enough. She told him what she came for. "Margaret, wench! Why, she's been gone to Wilson's these 2 hours. Ay, sure, you did say last night you would go, but she couldna rest in her bed, and so was off betimes this morning." Mary could do nothing but feel guilty of her long morning nap, and hasten to follow Margaret's steps, for, late as it was, she felt she could not settle well to her work, unless she learnt how kind, good Alice Wilson was going on. So, eating her crust of bread breakfast, she passed rapidly along the street. She remembered afterwards the little groups of people she had seen, eagerly hearing and imparting news, but at the same time her only care was to hasten on her way, in dread of a reprimand from Miss Simmonds. She went into the house at Jane Wilson's, her heart at the instant giving a strange knock, and sending the rosy flush into her face, at the thought that Jem might possibly be inside the door. But I do assure you, she had not thought of it before. Impatient and loving as she was, her solicitude about Alice on that hurried morning had not been mingled with any thought of him. Her heart need not have leaped, her colour need not have rushed so painfully to her cheeks, for he was not there. There was the round table, with a cup and saucer, which had evidently been used, and there was Jane Wilson sitting on the other side, crying quietly, while she ate her breakfast with a sort of unconscious appetite. And there was Mrs. Davenport washing away at a nightcap, or so, which, by their simple, old-world make, Mary knew at a glance were Alice's. But nothing. No one else. Alice was much the same, or rather better of the two, they told her. At any rate she could speak, though it was sad, rambling talk. Would Mary like to see her? Of course she would. Many are interested by seeing their friends under the new aspect of illness, and among the poor there is no wholesome fear of injury, or excitement, to restrain this wish. So Mary went upstairs, accompanied by Mrs. Davenport, wringing the suds off her hands, and speaking in a loud whisper far more audible than her usual voice. "I mun be hastening home, but I'll come again to-night, time enough to iron her cap. 'Twould be a sin and a shame if we let her go dirty now she's ill, when she's been so rare and clean her whole life long. But she's sadly forsaken, poor thing. She'll not know you, Mary; she knows none of us." The room upstairs held two beds, one superior in the grandeur of four posts and checked curtains to the other, which had been occupied by the twins in their brief lifetime. The smaller had been Alice's bed since she had lived there, but with the natural reverence to one stricken of God and afflicted, she had been installed, since her paralytic stroke the evening before, in the larger and grander bed, while Jane Wilson had taken her short broken rest on the little pallet. Margaret came forward to meet her friend, whom she half expected, and whose step she knew. Mrs. Davenport returned to her washing. The two girls did not speak; the presence of Alice awed them into silence. There she lay with the rosy colour, absent from her face since the days of childhood, flushed once more into it by her sickness nigh unto death. She lay on the affected side, and with her other arm she was constantly sawing the air, not exactly in a restless manner, but in a monotonous, incessant way, very trying to a watcher. She was talking away, too, almost as constantly, in a low, indistinct tone. But her face, her profiled countenance, looked calm and smiling, even interested by the ideas that were passing through her clouded mind. "Listen," said Margaret, as she stooped her head down to catch the muttered words more distinctly. "What will mother say? The bees are turning homeward for the last time, and we've got a terrible long bit to go yet. See, here's a linnet's nest in this goosh bush. The hen bird is on it. Look at her bright eyes, she won't stir. Ay, we mun hurry home. Won't mother be pleased with the bonny lot of heather we've got? Make haste, Sally, maybe we shall have cockles for supper. I saw the cockleman's donkey turn up our way fra Arnside." Margaret touched Mary's hand, and the pressure in return told her that they understood each other, that they knew how, in this illness, to the old, world-weary woman, God had sent her a veiled blessing. She was once more in the scenes of her childhood, unchanged and bright as in those long-departed days, once more with the sister of her youth, the playmate of 50 years ago, who had, for nearly as many years, slept in a grassy grave in the little churchyard beyond Burton. Alice's face changed. She looked sorrowful, almost penitent. "Oh, Sally, I wish we'd told her. She thinks we were in church all the morning, and we've gone on deceiving her. If we'd told her at first how it was, how sweet the hawthorn smelt through the open church door, and how we were on the last bench in the aisle, and how it were the first butterfly we'd seen this spring, and how it flew into the very church itself. Oh, mother is so gentle, I wish we'd told her. I'll go to her next time she comes inside and say, 'Mother, we were naughty last Sabbath.'" She stopped, and a few tears came stealing down the withered cheek, at the thought of the temptation and deceit of her childhood. Surely many sins could not have darkened that innocent, childlike spirit since. Mary found a red-spotted pocket-handkerchief, and put it into the hand which sought about for something to wipe away the trickling tears. She took it with a gentle murmur. "Thank you, mother." Mary pulled Margaret away from the bed. "Don't you think she's happy, Margaret?" "Ay, that I do, bless her. She feels no pain, and knows nought of her present state. Oh, that I could see Mary! I try and be patient with her afore me, but I'd give aught I have to see her, and see what she wants. I'm so useless! I mean to stay here as long as Jane Wilson is alone, and I would fain be here to-night, but—" "I'll come," said Mary, decidedly. "Mrs. Davenport said she'd come again, but she's hard worked all day. I'll come," repeated Mary. "Do," said Margaret, "and I'll be here till you come. Maybe Jem and you could take the night between you, and Jane Wilson might get a bit of sound sleep in his bed, for she were up and down the better part of last night, and just when she were in a sound sleep this morning, between 2 and 3, Jem came home, and the sound o' his voice roused her in a minute." "Where had he been till that time o' night?" asked Mary. "Nay, it were none of my business, and indeed I never saw him till he came in here to see Alice. He were in again this morning, and seemed sadly downcast. But you'll, maybe, manage to comfort him to-night, Mary," said Margaret, smiling, while a ray of hope glimmered in Mary's heart, and she felt almost glad, for an instant, of the occasion which would at last bring them together. Oh, happy night! When would it come? Many hours had yet to pass. Then she saw Alice, and repented, with a bitter self-reproach. But she could not help having gladness in the depths of her heart, blame herself as she would. She tried not to think as she hurried along to Miss Simmonds', with a dancing step of lightness. She was late, that she knew she should be. Miss Simmonds was vexed and cross. That also she had anticipated, and had intended to smooth her raven down by extraordinary diligence and intention. But there was something about the girls she did not understand, had not anticipated. They stopped talking when she came in, or rather I should say stopped listening, for Sally Leadbitter was the talker to whom they were hearkening with deepest attention. At first they eyed Mary, as if she had acquired some new interest to them since the day before. Then they began to whisper, and absorbed as Mary had been in her own thoughts, she could not help becoming aware that it was of her they spoke. At last Sally Leadbitter asked Mary if she had heard the news? "No, what news?" answered she. The girls looked at each other with a gloomy mystery. Sally went on. "Have you not heard that young Mr. Carson was murdered last night?" Mary's lips could not utter a negative, but no one who looked at her pale and terror-stricken face could have doubted that she had not heard before of the fearful occurrence. "Oh, it is terrible, that sudden information, that one you have known has met with a bloody death. You seem to shrink from the world where such deeds can be committed, and to grow sick with the idea of the violent and wicked men of earth." Much as Mary had learned to dread him lately, now he was dead, and dead in such a manner, her feeling was that of oppressive sorrow for him. The room went round and round, and she felt as though she should faint, but Miss Simmonds came in, bringing a waft of fresher air as she opened the door, to refresh the body, and the certainty of a scolding for inattention to brace the sinking mind. She, too, was full of the morning's news. "Have you heard any more of this horrid affair, Miss Barton?" asked she, as she settled to her work. Mary tried to speak. At first she could not, and when she succeeded in uttering a sentence, it seemed as though it were not her own voice that spoke. "No, ma'am, I never heard of it till this minute." "Dear! That's strange, for every one is up about it. I hope the murderer will be found out, that I do. Such a handsome young man to be killed as he was. I hope that wretch that did it may be hanged as high as Haman." One of the girls reminded them that the assizes came on next week. "Ay," replied Miss Simmonds, "and the milkman told me they will catch the wretch, and have him tried and hung in less than a week. Serve him right, whoever he is. Such a handsome young man as he was!" Then each began to communicate to Miss Simmonds the various reports they had heard. Suddenly she burst out, "Miss Barton, as I live, dropping tears on that new silk gown of Mrs. Hawkes's. Don't you know they will stain and make it shabby for ever? Crying like a baby because a handsome young man meets with an untimely end. For shame of yourself, miss! Mind your character and your work, if you please. Or if you must cry," seeing her scolding rather increased the flow of Mary's tears than otherwise, "take this print to cry over. That won't be marked like this beautiful silk," rubbing it, as if she loved it, with a clean pocket handkerchief, in order to soften the edges of the hard round drops. Mary took the print, and naturally enough, having had leave given to her to cry over it, rather checked the inclination to weep. Everybody was full of the one subject. The girls sent out to match silk, came back with the account gathered at the shop, of the coroner's inquest then sitting. The ladies who called to speak about gowns first began about the murder, and mingled details of that with directions for their dresses. Mary felt as though the haunting horror were a nightmare, a fearful dream, from which awakening would relieve her. The picture of the murdered body, far more ghastly than the reality, seemed to swim in the air before her eyes. Sally Leadbitter looked and spoke of her, almost accusingly, and made no secret now of Mary's conduct, more blamable to her fellow working women for its later changeableness, than for its former giddy flirting. "Poor young gentleman," said one, as Sally recounted Mary's last interview with Mr. Carson. "What a shame!" exclaimed another, looking indignantly at Mary. "That's what I call regular jilting," said a third, "and he lying cold and bloody in his coffin now." Mary was more thankful than she could express when Miss Simmonds returned to put a stop to Sally's communications, and to check the remarks of the girls. She longed for the peace of Alice's sick room. No more thinking with infinite delight of her anticipated meeting with Jem. She felt too much shocked for that now, but longing for peace and kindness, for the images of rest and beauty, and sinless times long ago, which the poor old woman's rambling presented. She wished to be as near death as Alice, and to have struggled through this world, whose sufferings she had early learnt, and whose crimes now seemed pressing close upon her. Old texts from the Bible, that her mother used to read, or rather spell out, aloud in the days of childhood, came up to her memory. When the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, etc. And it was to that world Alice was hastening. Oh, that she were Alice! I must return to the Wilsons' house, which was far from being the abode of peace that Mary was picturing it to herself. You remember the reward Mr. Carson offered for the apprehension of the murderer of his son? It was in itself a temptation, and to aid to its efficacy came the natural sympathy for the aged parents mourning for their child, for the young man cut off in the flower of his days; and besides this, there is always a pleasure in unravelling a mystery, in catching at the gossamer clue which will guide to certainty. This feeling, I am sure, gives much impetus to the police. Their senses are ever and always on the qui vive, and they enjoy the collecting and collating evidence, and the life of adventure they experience, a continual unwinding of Jack Sheppard romances, always interesting to the vulgar and uneducated mind, to which the outward signs and tokens of crime are ever exciting. There was no lack of clue or evidence at the coroner's inquest that morning. The shot, the finding of the body, the subsequent discovery of the gun, were rapidly deposed to, and then the policeman who had interrupted the quarrel between Jem Wilson and the murdered young man was brought forward, and gave his evidence, clear, simple, and straightforward. The coroner had no hesitation, the jury had none, but the verdict was cautiously worded, "Wilful murder against some person unknown." This very cautiousness, when he deemed the thing so sure as to require no caution, irritated Mr. Carson. It did not soothe him that the superintendent called the verdict a mere form, exhibited a warrant empowering him to seize the body of Jem Wilson committed on suspicion, declared his intention of employing a well-known officer in the detective service to ascertain the ownership of the gun, and to collect other evidence, especially as regarded the young woman, about whom the policeman deposed that the quarrel had taken place. Mr. Carson was still excited and irritable, restless in body and mind. He made every preparation for the accusation of Jem the following morning before the magistrates. He engaged attorneys skilled in criminal practice to watch the case and prepare briefs. He wrote to celebrated barristers coming the northern circuit, to bespeak their services. A speedy conviction, a speedy execution, seemed to be the only things that would satisfy his craving thirst for blood. He would have fain been policeman, magistrate, accusing speaker, all, but most of all, the judge, rising with full sentence of death on his lips. That afternoon, as Jane Wilson had begun to feel the effect of a night's disturbed rest, evinced in frequent dropping off to sleep, while she sat by her sister-in-law's bedside, lulled by the incessant crooning of the invalid's feeble voice, she was startled by a man speaking in the house-place below, who, wearied of knocking at the door, without obtaining any answer, had entered and was calling lustily for "Missus! Missus!" When Mrs. Wilson caught a glimpse of the intruder through the stair-rails, she at once saw he was a stranger, a working man; it might be a fellow labourer with her son, for his dress was grimy enough for the supposition. He held a gun in his hand. "May I make bold to ask if this gun belongs to your son?" She first looked at the man, and then, weary and half asleep, not seeing any reason for refusing to answer the inquiry, she moved forward to examine it, talking while she looked for certain old-fashioned ornaments on the stock. "It looks like his. Ay, it is his, sure enough. I could speak to it anywhere by these marks. You see, it were his grandfather's as were gamekeeper to some one up in the north. They don't make guns so smart nowadays. But how comed you by it? He sets great store on it. Is he bound for the shooting gallery? He is not, for sure, now his aunt is so ill, and left me all alone." And the immediate cause of her anxiety being thus recalled to her mind, she entered on a long story of Alice's illness, interspersed with recollections of her husband's and her children's death. The disguised policeman listened for a minute or two, to glean any further information he could, and then, saying he was in a hurry, he turned to go away. She followed him to the door, still telling him her troubles, and was never struck, until it was too late to ask the reason, with the unaccountableness of his conduct, in carrying the gun away with him. Then, as she heavily climbed the stairs, she put away the wonder and the thought about his conduct, by determining to believe he was some workman with whom her son had made some arrangement about shooting at the galley, or mending the old weapon, or something or other. She had enough to fret her, without moidering herself about old guns. Jem had given it to him to bring it to her, so it was safe enough; or if it was not, why, she should be glad never to set eyes on it again, for she could not abide firearms, they were so apt to shoot people. So comforting herself for the want of thought in not making further inquiry, she fell off into another doze, feverish, dream-haunted, and unrefreshing. Meanwhile the policeman walked off with his prize, with an odd mixture of feelings, a little contempt, a little disappointment, and a good deal of pity. The contempt and the disappointment were caused by the widow's easy admission of the gun being her son's property, and her manner of identifying it by the ornaments. He liked an attempt to baffle him. He was accustomed to it. It gave him some exercise to his wits and his shrewdness. There would be no fun in fox-hunting if Reynard yielded himself up without any effort to escape. Then again, his mother's milk was yet in him, policeman, officer of the detective service though he was, and he felt sorry for the old woman, whose softness had given such material assistance in identifying her son as the murderer. However, he conveyed the gun, and the intelligence he had gained, to the superintendent, and the result was that in a short time afterwards 3 policemen went to the works at which Jem was foreman, and announced their errand to the astonished overseer, who directed them to the part of the foundry where Jem was then superintending a casting. Dark, black were the walls, the ground, the faces around them, as they crossed the yard. But in the furnace-house a deep and lurid red glared over all. The furnace roared with mighty flame. The men, like demons, in their fire and soot colouring, stood swart about, awaiting the moment when the tons of solid iron should have melted down into a fiery liquid, fit to be poured, with still, heavy sound, into the delicate moulding of fine black sand, prepared to receive it. The heat was intense, and the red glare grew every instant more fierce. The policemen stood awed with the novel sight. Then black figures, holding strange-shaped bucket shovels, came athwart the deep red furnace light, and clear and brilliant flowed forth the iron into the appropriate mould. The buzz of voices rose again. There was time to speak, and gasp, and wipe the brows, and then one by one the men dispersed to some other branch of their employment. Number B-72 pointed out Jem as the man he had seen engaged in a scuffle with Mr. Carson, and then the other 2 stepped forward and arrested him, stating of what he was accused, and the grounds of the accusation. He offered no resistance, though he seemed surprised, but calling a fellow workman to him, he briefly requested him to tell his mother he had got into trouble, and could not return home at present. He did not wish her to hear more at first. So Mrs. Wilson's sleep was next interrupted in almost an exactly similar way to the last, like a recurring nightmare. Missus! Someone called out from below. Again it was a workman, but this time a blacker-looking one than before. "What do you want?" she said, peevishly. "Only nothing but—" stammered the man, a kind-hearted, matter-of-fact person, with no invention but a great deal of sympathy. "Well, speak out, can't ye, and ha' done with it? Jem's in trouble," said he, repeating Jem's very words, as he could think of no others. "Trouble!" said the mother, in a high-pitched voice of distress. "Trouble! God help me, trouble will never end, I think. What do you mean by trouble? Speak out, man, can't you? Is he ill? My boy, tell me, is he ill?" in a hurried voice of terror. "Na, that's not it. He's well enough. All he bade me say was, tell mother I'm in trouble, and I can't come home to-night." "Not come home to-night! And what am I to do with Alice? I can't go on wearing my life out with watching. He might come home and help me." "I tell you he can't," said the man. "Can't! And he is well, you say? Stuff! It's just that he's getting like other young men, and wants to go a-larking. But I'll give it to him when he gets back." The man turned to go. He durst not trust himself to speak in Jem's justification. But she would not let him off. She stood between him and the door, as she said, "You shall not go till you've told me what he's after. I can see plain enough you know, and I'll know too before I've done." "You'll know soon enough, missus." "I'll know now, I tell you. What's up that he can't come home and help me nurse? Me as never got a wink o' sleep last night with watching." "Well, if you will have it out," said the poor badgered man, "the police have got a hold on him." "On my Jem!" said the enraged mother. "You're a downright liar, and that's what you are. My Jem as never did harm to any one in his life. You're a liar, that's what you are." "He's done harm enough now," said the man, angry in his turn, "for there's good evidence he murdered young Carson as was shot last night." She staggered forward to strike the man for telling the terrible truth, but the weakness of old age, of motherly agony, overcame her, and she sank down on a chair and covered her face. He could not leave her. When next she spoke, it was in an imploring, feeble, childlike voice. "Oh, master, say you're only joking. I ax your pardon if I have vexed you, but please say you're only joking. You don't know what Jem is to me." She looked humbly, anxiously up to him. "I wish I were only joking, missus, but it's as true as I say. They've taken him up on the charge of murder. It were his gun as found near the place, and one of the police heard him quarrelling with Mr. Carson a few days back, about a girl." "About a girl!" broke in the mother, once more indignant, though too feeble to show it as before. "My Jem was as steady as—" She hesitated for a comparison wherewith to finish, and then repeated, "as steady as Lucifer, and he were an angel, you know. My Jem was not one to quarrel about a girl." "Ay, but it was that, though. They'd got her name quite pat. The man had heard all they said. Mary Barton was her name, whoever she may be." "Mary Barton, the dirty hussy! To bring my Jem into trouble of this kind. I'll give it her well when I see her, that I will. Oh, my poor Jem!" rocking herself to and fro. "And what about the gun? What did you say about that?" "His gun were found on the spot where the murder were done." "That's a lie, for one, then. A man has got the gun now, safe and sound. I saw it not an hour ago." The man shook his head. "Yes, he has indeed. A friend o' Jem's as he'd lent it to." "Do you know the chap?" asked the man, who was really anxious for Jem's exculpation, and caught a gleam of hope from her last speech. "No, I can't say as I did. But he were put on as a workman." "It's maybe only one of them policemen, disguised." "Nay, they'd never go for to do that, and trick me into telling on my own son. It would be like seething a kid in its mother's milk, and that the Bible forbids." "I don't know," replied the man. Soon afterwards he went away, feeling unable to comfort, yet distressed at the sight of sorrow. She would fain have detained him, but go he would. And she was alone. She never for an instant believed Jem guilty. She would have doubted if the sun were fire, first. But sorrow, desolation, and at times anger, took possession of her mind. She told the unconscious Alice, hoping to rouse her to sympathy, and then was disappointed, because, still smiling and calm, she murmured of her mother, and the happy days of infancy. Chapter 19.
Of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Mary Barton, by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 20. Mary's Dream and the Awakening. I saw where stark and cold he lay, beneath the gallows tree, and every one did point and say, 'Twas there he died for thee. O, weeping heart, O, bleeding heart, what boots thy pity now? Bid from his eyes that shade depart, that death damp from his brow. The Birtle Tragedy. So there was no more peace in the house of sickness except to Alice, the dying Alice. But Mary knew nothing of the afternoon's occurrences, and gladly did she breathe in the fresh air as she left Miss Simmonds' house to hasten to the Wilsons'. The very change from the indoor to the outdoor atmosphere seemed to alter the current of her thoughts. She thought less of the dreadful subject which had so haunted her all day. She cared less for the upbraiding speeches of her fellow workwomen. The old association of comfort and sympathy received from Alice gave her the idea that, even now, her bodily presence would soothe and compose those who were in trouble, changed, unconscious, and absent though her spirit might be. Then again she reproached herself a little for the feeling of pleasure she experienced, in thinking that he whom she dreaded could never more beset her path, in the security with which she could pass each street corner, each shop where he used to lie in ambush. O beating heart, was there no other little thought of joy lurking within, to gladden the very air without? Was she not going to meet, to see, to hear Jem, and could they fail at last to understand each other's loving hearts? She softly lifted the latch with the privilege of friendship. He was not there, but his mother was standing by the fire, stirring some little mess or other. Never mind, he would come soon, and with an unmixed desire to do her graceful duty to all belonging to him, she stepped lightly forwards, unheard by the old lady, who was partly occupied by the simmering, bubbling sound of her bit of cookery, but more with her own sad thoughts and wailing, half-uttered murmurings. Mary took off bonnet and shawl with speed, and, advancing, made Mrs. Wilson conscious of her presence by saying, "Let me do that for you. I'm sure you mun be tired." Mrs. Wilson slowly turned round, and her eyes gleamed like those of a pent-up wild beast as she recognized her visitor. "And is it thee that dares set foot in this house after what has come to pass? Is it not enough to have robbed me of my boy with thy arts and thy profligacy, but thou must come here to crow over me, his mother? Dost thou know where he is, thou bad hussy, with thy great blue eyes and yellow hair, to lead men on to ruin? Out upon thee with thy angel's face, thou whited sepulchre! Dost thou know where Jem is, all through thee?" "No," quivered out poor Mary, scarcely conscious that she spoke, so daunted, so terrified was she by the indignant mother's greeting. "He is lying in the New Bailey," slowly and distinctly spoke the mother, watching the effect of her words, as if believing in their infinite power to pain. "There he lies, waiting to take his trial for murdering young Mr. Carson." There was no answer. But such a blanched face, such wild distended eyes, such trembling limbs, instinctively seeking support. "Did you know Mr. Carson as now lies dead?" continued the merciless woman. "Folks say you did, and knew him but too well; and that for the sake of such as you, my precious child shot yon chap. But he did not. I know he did not. They may hang him, but his mother will speak to his innocence with her last dying breath." She stopped more from exhaustion than want of words. Mary spoke, but in so changed and choked a voice that the old woman almost started. It seemed as if some third person must be in the room, the voice was so hoarse and strange. "Please say it again. I don't quite understand you. What has Jem done? Please to tell me." "I never said he had done it. I said, and I'll swear, that he never did do it. I don't care who heard 'em quarrel, or if it is his gun as were found near the body. It's not my own Jem as would go for to kill any man, choose how a girl had jilted him. My own good Jem as was a blessing sent upon the house where he was born." Tears came into the mother's burning eyes as her heart recurred to the days when she had rocked the cradle of her first-born; and then, rapidly passing over events, till the full consciousness of his present situation came upon her, and perhaps annoyed at having shown any softness of character in the presence of the Delilah who had lured him to his danger, she spoke again, and in a sharp tone. "I told him, and told him to leave off thinking on thee, but he wouldn't be led by me. Thee, wench, thou wert not good enough to wipe the dust off his feet. A vile, flirting quean as thou art! It's well thy mother does not know, poor body, what a good-for-nothing thou art." "Mother, oh, mother," said Mary, as if appealing to the merciful dead. "But I was not good enough for him. I know I was not," added she, in a voice of touching humility. For through her heart went tolling the ominous, prophetic words he had used when he had last spoken to her. "Mary, you'll maybe hear of me as a drunkard, and maybe as a thief, and maybe as a murderer. Remember, when all are speaking ill of me, yo will have no right to blame me, for it's your cruelty that will have made me what I feel I shall become." And she did not blame him, though she doubted not his guilt. She felt how madly she might act if once jealous of him, and how much cause had she not given him for jealousy, miserable, guilty wretch that she was. Speak on, desolate mother. Abuse her as you will. Her broken spirit feels to have merited all. But her last humble, self-abased words had touched Mrs. Wilson's heart, sore as it was, and she looked at the snow-pale girl with those piteous eyes, so hopeless of comfort, and she relented in spite of herself. "Thou seest what comes of light conduct, Mary. It's thy doing that suspicion has lighted on him, who is as innocent as the babe unborn. Thou'lt have much to answer for if he's hung. Thou'lt have my death too at thy door." Harsh as these words seem, she spoke them in a milder tone of voice than she had yet used. But the idea of Jem on the gallows, Jem dead, took possession of Mary, and she covered her eyes with her wan hands, as if indeed to shut out the fearful sight. She murmured some words, which, though spoken low, as if choked up from the depths of agony, Jane Wilson caught. "My heart is breaking," said she feebly, "my heart is breaking." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Wilson. "Don't talk in that silly way. My heart has a better right to break than yours, and yet I hold up, you see. But oh dear, oh dear!" With a sudden revulsion of feeling, as the reality of the danger in which her son was placed pressed upon her, "What am I saying? How could I hold up if thou wert gone, Jem? Though I'm as sure as I stand here of thy innocence, if they hang thee, my lad, I will lie down and die." She wept aloud with bitter consciousness of the fearful chance awaiting her child. She cried more passionately still. Mary roused herself up. "Oh, let me stay with you, at any rate, till we know the end. Dearest Mrs. Wilson, mayn't I stay?" The more obstinately and upbraidingly Mrs. Wilson refused, the more Mary pleaded with ever the same soft, entreating cry, "Let me stay with you." Her stunned soul seemed to bound its wishes, for the hour at least, to remaining with one who loved and sorrowed for the same human being that she did. But no, Mrs. Wilson was inflexible. "I've, maybe, been a bit hard on you, Mary, I'll own that. But I cannot abide you yet with me. I cannot but remember it's your giddiness as has wrought this woe. I'll stay with Alice, and perhaps Mrs. Davenport may come help a bit. I cannot put up with you about me. Good night. To-morrow I may look on you different, maybe. Good night." And Mary turned out of the house, which had been his home, where he was loved and mourned for, into the busy, desolate, crowded street, where they were crying halfpenny broadsides, giving an account of the bloody murder, the coroner's inquest, and a raw head and bloody bones picture of the suspected murderer, James Wilson. But Mary heard not, she heeded not. She staggered on like one in a dream. With hung head and tottering steps, she instinctively chose the shortest cut to that home which was to her, in her present state of mind, only the hiding-place of four walls, where she might vent her agony, unseen and unnoticed by the keen, unkind world without, but where no welcome, no love, no sympathizing tears awaited her. As she neared that home, within 2 minutes' walk of it, her impetuous course was arrested by a light touch on her arm, and turning hastily she saw a little Italian boy with his humble show-box, a white mouse or some such thing. The setting sun cast its red glow on his face, otherwise the olive complexion would have been very pale, and the glittering teardrops hung on the long curled eyelashes. With his soft voice and pleading looks, he uttered, in his pretty broken English, the words, "Hungry, so hungry." And as if to aid by gesture the effect of the solitary word, he pointed to his mouth with its white quivering lips. Mary answered him impatiently, "Oh, lad, hunger is nothing, nothing." And she rapidly passed on. But her heart upbraided her the next minute with her unrelenting speech, and she hastily entered her door and seized the scanty remnant of food which the cupboard contained, and she retraced her steps to the place where the little hopeless stranger had sunk down by his mute companion in loneliness and starvation, and was raining down tears as he spoke in some foreign tongue, with low cries for the far distant "Mamma mia." With the elasticity of heart belonging to childhood, he sprang up as he saw the food the girl brought, she whose face, lovely in its woe, had tempted him first to address her, and with the graceful courtesy of his country, he looked up and smiled while he kissed her hand, and then poured forth his thanks, and shared her bounty with his little pet companion. She stood an instant, diverted from the thought of her own grief by the sight of his infantine gladness, and then bending down and kissing his smooth forehead, she left him, and sought to be alone with her agony once more. She re-entered the house, locked the door, and tore off her bonnet, as if greedy of every moment which took her from the full indulgence of painful, despairing thought. Then she threw herself on the ground, yes, on the hard flags she threw her soft limbs down, and the comb fell out of her hair, and those bright tresses swept the dusty floor, while she pillowed and hid her face on her arms, and burst forth into loud, suffocating sobs. O earth, thou didst seem but a dreary dwelling-place for thy poor child that night. None to comfort, none to pity, and self-reproach gnawing at her heart. Oh, why did she ever listen to the tempter? Why did she ever give ear to her own suggestions and cravings after wealth and grandeur? Why had she thought it a fine thing to have a rich lover? She had deserved it all. But he was the victim, he the beloved. She could not conjecture, she could not even pause to think who had revealed, or how he had discovered her acquaintance with Harry Carson. It was but too clear, some way or another, he had learnt all, and what would he think of her? No hope of his love. Oh, that she would give up and be content. It was his life, his precious life, that was threatened. Then she tried to recall the particulars, which, when Mrs. Wilson had given them, had fallen but upon a deafened ear, something about a gun, a quarrel, which she could not remember clearly. Oh, how terrible to think of his crime, his blood guiltiness, he who had hitherto been so good, so noble, and now an assassin! And then she shrank from him in thought, and then, with bitter remorse, clung more closely to his image with passionate self-upbraiding. Was it not she who had led him to that pit into which he had fallen? Was she to blame him? She to judge him? Who could tell how maddened he might have been by jealousy, how one moment's uncontrollable passion might have led him to become a murderer? And she had blamed him in her heart after his last deprecating, imploring, prophetic speech. Then she burst out crying afresh, and when weary of crying, fell to thinking again. The gallows! The gallows! Black it stood against the burning light which dazzled her shut eyes, press on them as she would. Oh, she was going mad! And for a while she lay outwardly still, but with the pulses careering through her head with wild vehemence. And then came a strange forgetfulness of the present, in thought of the long past times, of those days when she hid her face on her mother's pitying, loving bosom, and heard tender words of comfort, be her grief or her error what it might, of those days when she had felt as if her mother's love was too mighty not to last for ever, of those days when hunger had been to her, as to the little stranger she had that evening relieved, something to be thought about and mourned over, when Jem and she had played together, he with the condescension of an older child, and she, with unconscious earnestness, believing that he was as much gratified with important trifles as she was, when her father was a cheery-hearted man, rich in the love of his wife, and the companionship of his friend, when, for it still worked round to that, when mother was alive, and he was not a murderer. And then heaven blessed her unaware, and she sank from remembering, to wandering unconnected thought, and thence to sleep. Yes, it was sleep, though in that strange posture on that hard cold bed, and she dreamt of the happy times of long ago, and her mother came to her, and kissed her as she lay, and once more the dead were alive again in that happy world of dreams. All was restored to the gladness of childhood, even to the little kitten which had been her playmate and bosom friend then, and which had been long forgotten in her waking hours. All the loved ones were there. She suddenly awakened, clear and wide awake. Some noise had startled her from sleep. She sat up and put her hair, still wet with tears, back from her flushed cheeks and listened. At first she could only hear her beating heart. All was still without, for it was after midnight, such hours of agony had passed away, but the moon shone clearly in at the unshuttered window, making the room almost as light as day, in its cold, ghastly radiance. There was a low knock at the door. A strange feeling crept over Mary's heart, as if something spiritual were near, as if the dead, so lately present in her dreams, were yet gliding and hovering round her, with their dim, dread forms. And yet why dread? Had they not loved her? And who loved her now? Was she not lonely enough to welcome the spirits of the dead, who had loved her while here? If her mother had conscious being, her love for her child endured, so she quieted her fears and listened still. "Mary! Mary, open the door!" as a little movement on her part seemed to tell the being outside of her wakeful, watchful state. They were the accents of her mother's voice, the very south country pronunciation that Mary so well remembered, and which she had sometimes tried to imitate when alone, with the fond mimicry of affection. So, without fear, without hesitation, she rose and unbarred the door. There, against the moonlight, stood a form, so closely resembling her dead mother that Mary never doubted the identity, but exclaiming, as if she were a terrified child, secure of safety when near the protecting care of its parent, "Oh, mother, mother, you are come at last!" she threw herself, or rather fell, into the trembling arms of her long-lost, unrecognized Aunt Esther. End of Chapter 20. Recording by Leanne Howlett.